The year is 218 BC, and a vast army of Iberian and North African troops are preparing for an arduous journey, which would go on to become one of the most famous events in world history. Led by the legendary general Hannibal Barca, a man who made a vow to his father in his youth to devote his life to the destruction of the enemy that they marched to fight, is crossing the Alps, bound for the Italian peninsula, with the goal of destroying the state which had once humiliated Carthage 20 years prior. War had begun with the Roman Republic, and the Second Punic War would go on to be one of the most important conflicts in human history. Let's get into it. Following the peace negotiations of 241 BC and the end of the First Punic War, Rome controlled Sicily, and both sides were left far weaker, drained of money and manpower. Carthage made the mistake of trying to screw over its ex-mercenaries, which is never a good idea, and ended up having to fight these mercenaries by hiring even more mercenaries. Sometimes it pays to just stick to your word. Rome fought Gallic tribes to the north, as well as Illyrian pirates across the Adriatic, who had constantly been attacking their eastern ports. It also secured alliances with Greek and Italian states. And whilst the Romans were doing this, our friend Hamilcar Barca was invading Spain, a land divided between rival tribes. This was both as a way for Carthage to make up for the loss of Sicily, and to get a leg up on the Romans. He was very successful here in establishing what really came down to a personal empire around a cult which made his family divine, and he built up strength required to fight the Romans, before dying and being succeeded by his son Hasdrubal, who had found his dynasty's impregnable capital of New Carthage. Tensions built up with Rome, and eventually, after Hamilcar was assassinated, his brother Hannibal, the same man who once vowed eternal hatred towards Rome, became the leader of a semi-independent Carthaginian kingdom in Spain. A respected soldier, who thanks to the work of his father was effectively worshipped as a god by his Spanish troops. Once again, war between the two powers was inevitable, and this time the Roman ally of Saguntum was attacked by Hannibal, a city across the river Ebro, which was the agreed boundary between the two powers. The Romans demanded that Carthage end besieging its ally. Carthage refused, stating that the city was in their territory, and Saguntum fell. Both powers began to assemble their forces, and so began the Second Punic War. Rome prepared three armies, one to attack Hannibal in Spain, led by the general Scipio the Elder, another to go to the African mainland, and another to essentially be a rearguard for the Italian peninsula. But Rome had forgot to consider one thing. Hannibal had 50 million power and rise of king. Hannibal, however, saw these plans and laughed, formulating a bold plan, assembling 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 67 elephants, and marched for Italy. The troops with him were unaware that this campaign would last for the next 17 years. Fighting a force of Gauls at the Rhone River, he headed towards the Alps. Scipio the Elder was aware of this but powerless to stop it, sending his troops to Spain as he returned to Italy to prepare a defence. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps into Italy was a logistical nightmare. His force was subject to guerrilla attacks from the locals, but the general organised his troops, pack animals and bloody elephants. The army that left the mountains was at about half strength, and now numbered 25,000, having lost many to the cold and to desertion. They rested up, but being in Roman territory, it wouldn't be long before the first battle with Scipio's forces. The general was accompanied by his young son, who would go on to become Scipio Africanus, but we'll get back to him. The first major encounter was the Battle of Ticinus, and was a defeat for the Romans, demonstrating to the northern tribes of the empire that Hannibal was a formidable opponent, and many sided with the foreign general. The African expedition was cancelled, and these troops, led by the impatient General Longus, were diverted north to fight Hannibal, and he trapped the force in a terribly disadvantaged battle, forcing the tired and hungry Romans to fight his well-rested troops, and massacred them before settling into winter camps. The following year it happened again, and 30,000 Romans were trapped and killed at the Battle of Lake Trasmarine, the worst defeat in Roman history, a record that would only stand for 1 year. The Roman army was ambushed as they marched past a lake. They were slaughtered on the beach or drowned. Hannibal was simply a military genius who was able to exploit their aggressive nature, and the desperate Romans saw no choice but to utilise the office of dictator, a word which conjures images of despots and tyrants in the modern day. But in the Roman Republic was an office in which a man was given absolute power for 1 year only to resolve a particularly dire situation, and the reins were handed to a man called Quintus Fabius Maximus, who unpopularly utilised what would come to be known as Fabian tactics, in which he refused to make the same mistake as his predecessors and denied battle to Hannibal. This worked, and for months there was no real fighting. Hannibal even had this absolutely genius policy to not attack lands that Fabius the Delayer, as he came to be known, owned. And then he would stir up rumours that the dictator and him had made up some kind of shady deal to protect his own assets. And these rumours were surely spread by his rival Varro. And this man was elected consul next year, and in 216 BC he and his co-consul raised 16 legions and marched south to meet Hannibal, who had been held up in a campaign to take the city of Capua and turn Rome's allies against it. The Carthaginians were set up in the town of Cannae. The strong Roman column advanced, and towards the beginning of the battle it seemed to be winning, pushing back Hannibal's weak centre line, but only his centre line. Hannibal had placed his strong infantry on the wings, and the Libyan troops remained in place. And before they knew it, the Romans had pushed so far forward that they were now fighting on 3 fronts. And this was when Hannibal's trap came to fruition, and his cavalry hammered into the Roman backline, creating a full encirclement. It was just an absolute masterclass of military strategy. Hannibal encircled a larger force. It's just mad. 50 to 70,000 Romans were killed at the Battle of Cannae, along with the cream of Roman leadership, similarly to Crécy or Agincourt for France. It's known as Hannibal's masterpiece and has been studied as one of the most famous battles in history. However, following it, he didn't press his advantage and take Rome, and continued turning Italian allies against Rome. And in the wake of this battle, no one would have blamed the Romans if they'd given up in 216 BC. They'd had so many defeats. Instead, they began to truly scrape the barrel and raised even more legions. And meanwhile, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal maintained pressure on the Romans in Spain, destroying the legions stationed there and killing Scipio the Elder. And in the wake of the death of Hiero of Syracuse in 215 BC, Carthage exploited a coup against his successor and regained control of most of the island. So Spain had fallen, Sicily had returned to Carthaginian control, and Hannibal was rampaging around Italy, having killed over 100,000 Romans. Things were going horrendously. A Roman force was moving south to retake Sicily, with many of the survivors of Cannae hoping to die in the siege there, and reclaim what was left of their honour. And during an interesting siege, in which the inventions of the Syracusan citizen Archimedes were used to defend the city, he made cranes to lift the Roman ships out to the sea and destroy them. But the city fell in 212 BC, after 2 years of siege, and the inventor was butchered by a legionnaire. The brutal retaking of Sicily marks a sort of turning point in the war. And around this time, a young rock star general began to rise, who would go on to be known as Scipio Africanus. So Roman forces retook Capua, which had sided with Hannibal. And then over the next few years, Hannibal continued to take cities, and Rome continued to retake cities. Skirmishes occurred, but for the next 5 years, both armies pretty much played cat and mouse around the Italian peninsula. In Iberia, however, the charismatic General Scipio the Younger was barely 25, and had volunteered to take up command there since no one else would. In 210 BC, he arrived with an army of 10,000 men. The following year, he assaulted the Barca family's fortress of New Carthage. The general himself led a small contingent of men into the city, letting his army in and capturing the fortress in less than 2 days. He then pardoned the local ruling families, who abandoned their support of Carthage in droves. And in the following years, Scipio had proved to be a master general, defeating Carthaginian armies and establishing Roman dominance of the peninsula. So by 207 BC, Hasdrubal fled Spain and was attempting to link up with his brother, who was running out of resources, in a campaign that was quickly starting to resemble that of his father in Sicily, having been abandoned by Carthage. This would allow the two brothers to create a force large enough to take Rome. However, Roman forces combined and destroyed Hasdrubal, along with hopes of a combined Carthaginian force that could end the war, at the Battle of Meritus, and Hasdrubal was killed there. In the wake of this victory in 205 BC, the now famed General Scipio was able to use the legitimacy that he gained from his victories in Spain, and the momentum of Hasdrubal's defeat to convince the Senate to authorise a full invasion of Africa. This was to the disdain of the elderly General Fabius, whose careful agenda had saved the city once, but wasn't going to win the war. Upon arriving in Africa, Scipio got to work relieving Carthage of its allies. He turned the Numidians to his side, and got their powerful cavalry for his army. This would go on to be an alliance that was just as fruitful as that with Hiero of Syracuse. Scipio destroyed 2 Carthaginian armies, leaving the capital with nothing to defend itself with, and the leadership was forced to recall Hannibal from Italy. The general was said to have cried when he received his orders, and got his army to board ships and leave Italy after 17 years. His life's work had been for nothing. Upon returning, Hannibal was given an army of poor quality recruits to bolster his existing force of veterans, and he began campaigning against Scipio. This culminated in their final confrontation at the Battle of Zama. The 2 greatest generals of their generation spoke, and acknowledged their mutual respect for one another, before Scipio and his experienced army forced battle to be given. And Scipio simply held all the cards, countering Hannibal's 80 elephants and pressing his advantage with his Numidian cavalry, winning the battle, and ending the Second Punic War. Hannibal was one of few to escape. And in the following peace negotiations, Hannibal ensured that Carthage would give no more resistance. Its dreams of an overseas empire were over, and it was forced to demilitarise. The population of Rome decreased by 17% during the Punic Wars. It was broke and exhausted, but it gained something priceless: undisputed control of the Western Mediterranean. The Iron generations that fought in the Punic Wars had suffered and endured unimaginable loss. But this, Rome's greatest victory, marked the point of decline of Roman virtue and honour. Scipio in his glory had paved the way for the Republic, and later Empire's history, to be dominated by cults of personality around great generals such as Sulla and Caesar. In saving the Republic, and leaving nothing in the world left to threaten or oppose it, he had set Rome on a path towards domination of the world, and a fall into decadence. Thanks for watching.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that.